If you're creating invoices by hand today by copying and pasting data, I'm here to tell you there is a much better way. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can do this very thing inside of QuickBooks using Airtable and Zapier automation. Now, you don't have to be using QuickBooks. This same process that I outlined here today can be used for other accounting software as well, such as Xero and different payment processors like Stripe. So if learning more about automating your payment processing is of interest to you, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and this is Gap Consulting. It's our mission to help you unlock the full potential of no-code tools, and Airtable and Zapier are two of those tools that we use in almost all of our projects. And every organization has some element of payment processing. There is some way in every organization, even if you're a non-for-profit, that you will need to process payments and keep track of invoices. And that's exactly what we're going to be breaking down in this video. But before I get to that, I first want to invite you to follow along with me. I will be using an Airtable template that we make freely available to you if you sign up at gapconsulting.io/templates. We will also be using Zapier, and so you can follow the exact automation that I build here in this video. Just follow it step by step. And if you're not already a Zapier user, I encourage you to sign up using the link that we share with this video. It's a great way for you to show some love back to the channel. But without further ado, let's hop on into my screen. We have to start with the back end in Airtable. Now I'm here inside of the template. This is the invoice and payment tracking template. If you want to look at the back end database, it's like this. And I need to point out that I am in a free Airtable plan right now. So even if you're not a paid Airtable user, you can access this very template. Now there are 4 key tables in this template. We have our clients table, invoices, line items, and services. So this is a list of all the different services we have that link to the different line items within a template where we say this service at this quantity, we know what the cost of the service is, and all of that information can roll up to the invoice. All right, so let's make a couple of assumptions here to get started. We're gonna have to make some additions to the back-end data before we can really build this thing out. Number 1, I'm going to head into my clients and I want to add inside of here a client ID number. I'm going to call this QBO client number. Now this stands for QuickBooks Online Client Number, and I'm going to use text here. Now the idea is that when we add a new client to our database, we will automatically create a corresponding customer object inside of QuickBooks. So this would be a separate automation than what we're going to show here, but you could do this by simply saying, when a new record is created in clients, go ahead and create that customer object inside of QuickBooks, and then come back into Airtable in the same automation and tell us what the client number is. Now for us, I'm going to use the same client ID for all of these folks. It's going to be 27. I'm just going to click and drag that down. But of course, when you're using this actually in the real world, you would have a different or unique number for every single one of these clients. And you would just update that here in Airtable and make sure that nobody ever edits it. The best way for you to prevent people from editing data that they shouldn't see is to only share access to your interfaces. So when you're sharing access to Airtable, of course, you want to build that interface layer on top and only share access to that. That way you can control what they see and what they can edit. Frankly, there's no reason for anyone on your team to ever have access to that QBO client number. We're only going to use it as a key when we're in our automation. Now, let's talk about the next component. I need to go into Invoices, and over here on the right, I'm going to add a new field, and it's going to be the last modified time. We want to know, when did we actually move that invoice to the finalized status? I'm looking specifically at this field right here. This is going to default to draft mode. So when we're creating a new invoice, it's in draft. When we finalize it, that's what's going to trigger our automation. And the best way to build a nice succinct automation with Zapier is to create that new field. And we're going to call it by the name of what this automation is, which is basically triggering the invoice creation. So I'll say trigger invoice. But in front of it, Here's a little hack for you. Whenever you're integrating Airtable with Zapier and other tools, let yourself know what that is. So we like to include a little emoji here, which is the lightning or the zap emoji, which is saying, hey, this is used with Zapier. This is a great way for you to kind of shorthand document the purpose of the different fields so that when you're editing it in the future, you know this is for automation. All right, now we're going to use the last modified time field here, but I only care about when the invoice status was updated. So we're going to add this here and create the field. So this is going to be a reflection of when that time is changed. So if I were to take this and move it to draft mode, then we're going to see that the trigger invoice field reflects that the last time it was changed was just a moment ago. Now, we don't want our automation to just trigger all the time, so we also need to include a filtered view here. Still in Airtable, I'm going to create a new view, and I'm going to, again, use that shorthand, that little zap symbol, and I will, again, call this trigger automation or trigger invoice. And we will create this new view and apply some filters. Now, the first condition is we're going to make sure the status of that invoice is specifically finalized. This way, we're not sending information to Zapier if we haven't moved it to finalized. I'll show you exactly where we set this up in the automation in just a moment. Now, we also want to add an additional field to our table, and that's going to be the invoice that we create in QuickBooks. So I will say QBO invoice, and I'll use, again, single text, just as we did in the previous table for clients where we brought in the item number or the client number inside of QuickBooks. Similarly, we're going to bring in the invoice number, and we will add that right here. Now, the purpose of this is so that when we create the invoice, we come back to Airtable and we say, this is the invoice. And in the future, when the invoice gets paid, we can look it up in Airtable and update the status, update the date paid, all of these different things. But also, it ensures that we don't create multiple invoices in QuickBooks on the same invoice, because we apply that same filter here to our view. So we can say, listen, we need to make sure that QBO invoice is empty, because if there is a value in here, that means we already ran the automation, which means we already created an invoice, and we certainly don't want to do it again. All right. Now, one final part, we need to look up the information from our clients because we have that special ID from QuickBooks. So in order to bring that in from the client, we can right-click on the link and add a lookup field. Now, the field we want to bring in is that new field we just added called QBO client number, and we will add the field. Now, right now, I am doing this for QuickBooks Online, but you can follow these same steps for different software as well if you're using something else to create your invoices. So long as there's an open API and it's connected or has Zapier integration, these steps are going to be the same, if not very similar. So we have the client number, perfect. And if we scroll all the way over, we also have our trigger invoice and our QBO invoice. This field is going to trigger the automation, and this is where we're going to write the invoice number once we've created it in QuickBooks. Time to head now into Zapier. So again, follow along in your own Zapier account, sign up using our link if you don't already have one. And here I am inside of folders. Folders are a great way in Zapier to organize all of your different automations. You can see that we have quite a few, and you can choose whether or not you want to share these folders with other people on your team, depending on the Zapier plan that you are on. Now, speaking of Zapier plans, since we are integrating with QuickBooks, it will require a pro account or better on Zapier. Now, most of the payment and invoicing software on Zapier does require a paid account, so make sure that you've upgraded to one of those accounts in order to get this access. I think when you see how much time an automation like this is going to save you, it's going to be a no-brainer for you to make that upgrade. It's honestly one of my favorite bills to pay every month because, as weird as it sounds, I know that that means I saved hundreds of hours of my time because all this stuff was automated in the background. To pay for a Zapier subscription, in my opinion, is a small cost. All right, here we are inside. We can go into a particular folder. I have one set up for examples here, and we will create a new automation, which Zapier calls a zap. So we'll create a new zap in this folder, and here we are in build mode. Now, the first thing we need to do is choose the automation trigger, and that is going to be Airtable. In Airtable, we're going to update that invoice status. So let's go ahead and find the Airtable software. This is our triggering mechanism, and we can choose the event. Now, we can do this with a new or updated record, or strictly with a new record. Now, of course, our records come into existence. Let's flip back into Airtable's interface. We have this invoice where we are working on creating it. It's in draft mode. And when we are ready to send it, this is inside of our Airtable interface, all we have to do is update it to finalized. So we're not working off of a brand new record. We're working off of an updated record. So we'll make that choice here in Zapier, a new or updated record. And now it's going to ask us which account we want to connect to. And I have several, but I'm going to go with my Gareth's example connection account here. Now we're going to move on to the next stage where we configure the trigger itself. So we have to choose the base. I happen to know the ID for my base, which I've pasted in here. If you don't know yours, you can just type it in, and provided that you've named your base appropriately, it's going to show up in the list. This is access to all the different bases that I have inside of Airtable, but you can also control what your connection is granting Zapier access to. So you can limit the number of bases that Zapier can actually see. But here we are, I've attached it to this, and I will choose my table, and we're triggering from Invoices. So make that selection, and now here is where we're going to find that last modified column. Now, if you recall, back in Airtable, we called it Trigger Invoice, and it was using the last modified time. This is the field type, and that's why we built this particular field. So we're going to map out to that. And you'll see that that's the only one that's available because it's the only last modified field in our entire table. Now we can limit it to a view. Now remember, we do not want to trigger this automation every time this time is updated, only under certain conditions, which is why we built the trigger invoice view. We're filtering out anything that already has an invoice and anything that is not a status of finalized, right? So let's go ahead and make sure that we bring that information now into our Zap trigger. We're limiting it to this view. Now, as a side note, a little hack here, I strongly recommend upgrading your Airtable account so that you can also limit changes to this view. I would love to be able to come in here and change this to either a personal view or a locked view, which I strongly recommend whenever you're using triggers like this for your automations in Zapier. Because if somebody makes changes now to the filters here, it could potentially trigger automations that you don't want to send out. So be sure to put as many locks and controls around it as possible. Strongly recommend the locked view, but it does require that you're on an upgraded Airtable plan and not a free plan. This is the one place that being on a free plan could cause problems for you. All right, so back inside of Zapier, we've limited it to this, and we can now test the trigger. We will perform the trigger, and it's going to actually look at Airtable and bring back information from these records. So what has it found? 3 different records that it brought in. And this one here is the total amount of $135,000. So we can flip back into Airtable. We see it's invoice 10,005. So the one that we're looking at is right here. This particular record, invoice 10005 for $135,000, is the thing that we're looking at. And we're going to use this through the future steps of our automation. So now that we've found some sample data and we know that everything is working so far so good, let's move on to the next step. We will say continue with selected record. Now it's time to say, what happens from here? What are the actions the automation will take? Well, of course, we are syncing up with QuickBooks here. So notice here that we have to be on that pro plan, as I mentioned. We'll click into QuickBooks Online, and we have a slew of different action events. This is where we create bills, we can add credit memos, we can create new customers. You'll definitely want to do this, as I mentioned earlier, in a separate automation, so that when you add a customer to your CRM, they're automatically also created in QuickBooks. But we are looking for creating an invoice. With line item and bundle item support, let's do it. This is the step we're looking for, and I've set up here a sandbox account. When you're setting this up, if you wanted to go through these steps yourself, you could simply say, connect a new account, and it's going to ask you for your credentials. I strongly recommend starting with a sandbox while you're testing. Once you are live, you will change into production. But for us, we'll stick with sandbox, okay? So I'm going to cancel that out and just go with the sandbox that I've already set up here, and we will continue. So now it's time to set up the invoice creation. First part is the customer. How do we know the customer? Well, we created the customer. And remember, I gave the customer ID 27. And that is going to correspond with a fake customer in QuickBooks called Video Games by Dan, who is an example in our test account here, our sandbox. And so what I don't want is to hard code right to this particular customer. No, I want to have some sort of search step that happens previously in the automation. So let's add a search step. And just like this, we're adding a step before us in the automation. So this is where we were working, and we just bumped another step in between. So Zapier in this way is really helpful because it's going to show us step by step. If we left a step out, no problem, we can go in and plug it in without much effort. So we have to search. How do we know what we're searching for? Well, we have a QuickBooks ID. We called it QBO client number from client. We're looking it up from that client record. It's 27. So there we go. We could alternatively add a step where we create that QuickBooks customer if they don't already exist. If you check this box, basically that means that if we don't find a customer, we'll create a new one and then use them in the next step. This is a hack inside of Zapier that makes the searching so much easier, because if you perform a search and you don't find the information, you don't have to build new action steps. It's just going to say, well, I didn't find anything. Let's go ahead and create it. But for us, we know that we already have a QuickBooks customer with the ID of 27 named Video Games by Dan, but we have to make sure that we update the search field. We don't want to search for a name. We want to search for that ID. We already have that ID number handy. So let's continue from here, and we will test our step. And if we did everything correctly, there we go. We're going to find exactly who this is. And in here somewhere, we should see Video Games by Dan. That is the name of this fake customer in our sandbox account. So far, so good. Now, we're going to use this information when we create the invoice. So let's continue now to what is step 3 in our automation. And we will create an invoice from here, say continue, and note that we already mapped to the proper customer that we found in step 2. Now, all of the remaining fields are optional. Now, obviously, you're going to want to fill some of them out or more of them depending on your situation. So let's take a quick look. We could bring in the email for sending this to. We could add a billing address and shipping address. We obviously have the invoice date. Anything that's available inside of Airtable from the record that triggered the automation, we can just map here by hitting the plus. So our invoice date came from step 1. And we can easily search for it. If we go in here and just say date, here's the date of the invoice, we can just drop it in that simply. So now every time the automation runs, it's going to take whatever information it gets from Airtable and use it here. We can include the due date as well. So again, I'll hit that plus and type in date, and here's our due date in Airtable. All of the information is available here. If you're actually shipping products, you can add tracking numbers, you can auto-generate an invoice number, or you can use the one that came from Airtable. You can map to your products and services. You can add descriptions. All of the different things that you would expect in creating an invoice are available for you here. Now, to keep our example very simple, I'm not going to go through looping all of the different quantities. If you are interested in seeing how you can create different line items in your invoice, let me know and we'll work on doing a video for that in the future. But for us, I'm just going to go right to the amount. I just want to make sure that we get that amount mapped from Airtable, and I'll bring it in, and we should have a value for the total. And there it is, total amount, $135,000. And there we go. Now, of course, we can choose to make it recurring or not. We can add different invoice IDs, message displayed, project IDs, you name it. Anything inside of QuickBooks we have access to in creating this invoice via automation. We can also determine if we're going to accept payment via bank transfer and or via credit card. You get the idea. Go through and make all of the different adjustments. Once you've plugged into the things that are optional, and of course, make sure that you plug into anything that is required as signified by that little asterisk, Now we're ready to test the creation of the invoice in our sample or sandbox space. Now, up until this point, we've been working in the sandbox environment, but when I went to actually test it off camera, we didn't have all of the required fields mapped appropriately. So I had to go back and actually work in a production environment. So if you run into the same hurdle here, just know that I experienced that hiccup as well. So I am going to now test the step in a production environment. Hopefully nobody receives an invoice for $135,000 and loses their mind. So let's go ahead and test this step. You will notice that I included my own billing email here, so I'm hoping to circumvent any automation outside of that. So we can see that the invoice was appropriately created in QuickBooks, and we can see who it was created for, that it was done in US dollars, that we had $135,000. Again, we went in and updated our own information. You'll need to do the same and map the different fields for your invoices. But the final step here is going back into Airtable and making sure that we record the fact that we created that invoice. So final step of the automation is going to be updating a record. We are going to update the record that triggered the automation. Again, linking up to the same connection as before. And we'll go into our base again, which I've copied into my clipboard, and we will update again our invoice table. Let's get there. And so we are updating again that invoice with the record that triggered the automation. How do we know it? Well, we already have that ID, but we need to go into a custom value here. So click on the hamburger here, select custom value. We'll open up the trigger from our automation and bring in the record ID. So this is saying I'm going to update the record that triggered the automation in step 1. And all we want to update here is the QBO invoice field. Now you can bring more information in if you want to. You can bring things in like the URL for the invoice, for example. But for us, we just want to bring in the invoice number. So again, this was occurring in step 3, and we can search down to look at invoice. To keep things simple, I could grab that invoice link, but let's see if I have a number. We also have a document number. But the point is we need to get something from QuickBooks that says, hey, this is unique to this particular invoice, and we're bringing it back over there. We might also have an ID that we could map to. Here it is. This is the invoice ID that we just created in step 3. Make sure that you're mapping to the appropriate step because the ID in step 2 was the customer ID, not the invoice ID. So let's map that invoice ID back here, and that will be the final step in our automation. We'll test this step. Let's flip back into Airtable and we will see that actually that invoice that we had opened, it's being moved right now because it just got updated with the invoice number, which then removes it from this view, meaning again that we won't create another and another invoice in QuickBooks. Now, the record still lives in Airtable, right? It's still here in a different view. It's just that we filled out the invoice number and it's been removed from this view, which means it's not going to be part of the automation. So once we're ready with all of this, all we have to do is publish the automation. We should probably name it as well to stay organized and turn it on. Once all of these steps have been made, now we can sit back and relax. And every time in the future that we are ready to publish an invoice to QuickBooks, all we have to do is in our Airtable interface, update that invoice status to finalized. It's going to find the customer in QuickBooks. It's going to then create an invoice for that customer. And then lastly, it's going to come back to Airtable and put that QuickBooks ID for that invoice back in this record so that we don't create another one. Hey, I know we went pretty quickly in this video. There is a lot to cover for even a straightforward automation like this. But when you implement things like this in your business, the amount of time that it's going to save you is next level. It will absolutely change the game for you when you start embracing automation. I wish you all the luck. And if you have questions we didn't answer here, feel free to swing by our website. We have tons of resources available for you. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, keep on building.